Now let's talk about the value of waiting until the turn for more information. Another bone of contention I have with certain authors is the theory that you should play your hands aggressively on the flop in order to better define your hand, and at the same time to gain more information from your opponents. This theory is actually very effective in limit hold'em, but that theory doesn't translate well to no-limit tournaments. The main reason is simple. It's too expensive. In limit hold'em, a raise represents just one unit, but in no-limit hold'em, if you're going to raise someone on the flop to find out where you're at, it will cost you a pretty penny. Let's look at an example. With blinds at 50 and 100, a player from early position makes it 300, and you call with ace-jack of hearts. The big blind calls, so three of you see the flop, ace-8-3. The big blind checks, and the pre-flop raiser bets out 800. If you were to raise him here, a standard raise would cost you about, say, 2,400 in chips. So let's say you do that. The big blind folds, and now the first raiser calls the bet. What information have you gained exactly? What if the under-the-gun player re-raises you? Well, in this case, it would seem as though you've gained some valuable information and your ace-jack is likely behind. You could fold and take your $2,400 loss. Now, in this same situation, let's look at the benefits of just calling on the flop, and you'll see that all the information that cost you $2,400 on the flop, you can get with an $800 call on the flop, coupled with a reevaluation on the turn. So now you just call on the flop, and the big blind folds. The turn card is a queen, and now your opponent bets 1,600. You still aren't sure if your ace-jack is the best hand, but the fact that your opponent bet again should lean you towards thinking that you're beat. Since you're unsure, though, you call the 1,600. Now, at this point, it's cost you the exact same amount of chips had you raised on the flop. The only difference is that you've made it all the way to the river. To help you figure out the best course of action on the river, you have the following information. My opponent raised before the flop and followed through with a continuation bet on the flop. I called the bet, a queen hit the turn, yet my opponent wasn't afraid and bet once again. I called that bet as well, so if my opponent makes a big bet at the river, he has to know that I have a strong hand and I'm not on a draw. That's a lot of information. Your opponent could still bluff you on the river, but the same could be said about his flop re-raise. He may be coming over the top of you on the flop with a weaker ace or just as a bluff. There is one other key benefit to smooth calling on the flop in this situation rather than raising. You allow yourself a chance to suck out. If your opponent has, say, ace-king, bets the 800, you make it 2,400, and now he re-raises you off the hand, you've just lost 2,400 with no chance to get lucky. However, if you just call the flop, you can get really lucky and spike a jack on the turn or river. Or you could even make a backdoor flush with the hand and possibly win an even bigger pot. The only real benefit to raising on the flop is that you protect your hand from being outdrawn when you're ahead, and you also get information about your opponent's hand quicker. Getting outdrawn with ace-jack on an ace-8-3 rainbow flop should be the least of your concerns. If you are in the lead, then you'll be substantially in the lead. A worse ace can only hit one of 3 kickers, and a pocket pair can only hit one of 2 cards. The biggest threat is a total of 5 outs if your opponent has a hand like 8-9. That's hardly something to be overly concerned about. As for the other benefit, who cares when you find out your opponent has you beat? If it costs you no less to see the river, but it takes longer to come to the conclusion that your opponent has you beat, how can that really hurt you? Let's look at another example, which combines several small ball concepts. Blinds are 200, 400 with a 50 ante when a player from middle position raises to 1,200, and you are right behind him with pocket queens and smooth calling before the flop. The big blind also calls, putting 4,250 into the pot pre-flop. You're sitting on 85,000 in chips, the big blind has about 22,000 in chips, and the pre-flop raiser has about 71,000. Now the flop comes jack 4-5. The big blind checks, and the pre-flop raiser bets 3,000. You could make a case for raising here to knock out the player in the big blind, but that's a risky play in this situation, and here's why. Suppose you make it 12,000 to find out where you're at, and the big blind folds. Now it gets back to the first raiser, who decides to go all in. You don't know much about this player, so you're in no man's land as to what you should do. You're behind aces and kings in any set, but you can be top pair. The real problem lies in the fact that if your opponent has ace-jack, he may genuinely feel like he has the best hand and push. Because you smooth called before the flop, playing safe, careful, small ball poker, he might think that you have a jack with a worse kicker. The safe play for you to make here would be to fold the hand, forfeiting the 12,000 you pitted on the flop, plus the 1,200 you called before the flop. All the while, you could easily be folding the best hand. Once again, let's see what changes when you just call on the flop. If you smooth call on the flop, your opponent may put you on one of the following hands: a jack with a mediocre kicker, a pocket pair like 9s or 10s, or possibly a set of 4s, 5s, or even jacks. If the turn comes a blank, he will likely give up on the hand if he can't beat a pair of jacks, but might continue to bet with a pair of jacks or better. You, on the other hand, have a strong overpair, but your opponent could easily be holding a bigger pair or even a set. If your opponent bets the turn again, I would actually suggest smooth calling once again. Unless the turn comes an ace, then you will have to do your best to try and get a read on your opponent. If you can't come up with anything, you should still call the turn provided that the bet isn't too big. Okay, obviously anytime you choose to play what appears to be weak poker, there must be something that you're giving up. That's true, but there are also several things you gain. What you give up: free cards. By not playing aggressively on the flop or the turn, you give your opponent a free shot to outdraw you. But how risky is that really? If your opponent has a pocket pair smaller than yours and you allow him to see the turn and the river, he will win the pot just about 8% of the time. If your opponent had ace-jack, he'd have a total of 5 outs against you. If he sees the turn and the river, he'll win the pot just about 20% of the time. That's really not that scary, especially consider the fact that if he does outdraw you, you'll get to see it. An ace or a jack on the turn would both be scare cards to your hand. The biggest draw he could legitimately have would be ace-king. With ace-king, if he gets to the river, he'll outdraw you about 23% of the time. It's a risk, but I wouldn't call it the end of the world when you factor in the benefits of being cautious. What do you gain? You trap an opponent with top pair into continuing to bet thinking he has the best hand. You show weakness, which he may pick up on and decide to try and push through the hand with something like pocket nines. Lastly, by playing this particular hand cautiously, you make it highly unlikely that you'll be bluffed off the best hand. Over the years, there has been so much emphasis on being aggressive, and the idea of being passive is often seen as weak or poor play. Aggressive players may even mock a player who proceeds cautiously, not understanding that there's a time to be aggressive and there's a time to be careful and protect your stack. Aggressive players will often amass large stacks of chips by playing wildly aggressive after the flop. But if they continue to play recklessly, it's only a matter of time before they run into a trap that they can't escape. Playing small bet poker as a style will keep you involved in lots of pots, but the main objective is to win the pots you're supposed to without taking any unnecessary risks. A small ball player isn't trying to get all in before the flop with queens, get all in on the flop with top pair, or even an overpair. In fact, a small ball player doesn't ever want to be all in at any point in a tournament, unless of course they have the absolute nuts. Playing cautiously after the flop will help you avoid getting involved in large pots in marginal situations. Yes, you'll lose some extra pots when your opponents outdraw you, but you will more than make up for that with the money you save by avoiding big pots, as well as the money you earn by letting your opponents bet your hand for you.